Hello everyone, this is going to be my video where I talk about how I have reread The Lord of the Rings and how it was such a different experience. And I want to preface with what this video is not going to be. This is not going to be me being the reader police and being like, if you didn't enjoy Lord of the Rings, you have to reread it and you have to do it better. When I say I read Lord of the Rings wrong, I am of course being ironic. I obviously, think that going in with the expectations I had led to enjoying it more. But, if you didn't like Lord of the Rings and don't want to go reread it, obviously I'm not saying you have to go do it or you need to read it better. I do think if you read it similarly to me the first time, and you hear me talk about it here, and you think, maybe I would enjoy it more, I'd encourage you to try, if that sounds like something you would like to do. But I'm not trying to tell anyone that they did it wrong here. This is just a reflection on my experience and how expectations played such a huge role into how much I enjoyed this book. Anyways, let's get into it. So first, I feel the need to talk about what my original reaction to The Lord of the Rings was. I read Lord of the Rings for the first time somewhat late relative to a lot of fantasy readers. I read it in 2020. So I'd already read a lot of fantasy multiple times. I read it was directly after The Wheel of Time. And basically the first time I read it, I struggled a little bit with the writing style. I really liked the story itself and the world. I'd watched the movies many times, so I knew I did like the story. I did not connect strongly to the characters, and it came down to the biggest thing is, I said the character, I'm gonna put up Discord messages from past me, which I don't agree with now, but you're gonna see the change in the Discord messages over time compared to reread. I just failed to connect to the characters. They didn't feel human. It felt like, as an example, I said things like the crew and the Fellowship, especially Sam's, complete loyalty to Frodo didn't feel like that was completely earned. And I think you could make a case that in terms of how humans tend to act, that people would probably not have been as loyal to Frodo as they are. And this is the style of character writing that I was coming from. I had just read The Wheel of Time and The Witcher, which very much is this style. Both of those series are trying to show a very almost critical view of humanity. Balanced, but critical about, how humans can be cruel or selfish, even when there is great conflict or evil on the horizon, how complicated it would be to unite. And that's just not what Tolkien's trying to do. Lord of the Rings is a romantic tale about how humanity can be. And the thing that kind of sparked the need to reread Lord of the Rings, and the idea that I did not read it under the right frame of reference, was actually something I saw Tolkien wrote about the sequel he started writing, that he wrote 13 pages of, called The New Shadow, where he said this. I'm going to put it up on the screen and read it. I did begin a story placed about 100 years after the downfall, but it proved both sinister and depressing. Since we are dealing with men, it is inevitable that we should be concerned with the most regrettable features of their nature, their quick satiety with good, so that the people of Gondor in times of peace, justice, and prosperity would become discontented and restless, while the dynasts descended from Aragorn would become just kings and governors, like Denethor or worse. I found that even so early, there was an outgroup of revolutionary plots about a center of secret, satanistic religion with Gondorian boys while Gondorian boys were playing at being orcs and going around doing damage. I could have written a thriller about the plot and its discovery and overthrow, but it would have been just that, not worth doing. And that made me think of what Tolkien was trying to do with Lord of the Rings, because writing about the worst nature of mankind and, the bad aspects of their nature is what a lot of fantasy is doing on purpose. They obviously would make the case that it is worth doing, and I would agree, but it's important that Tolkien thought it wasn't worth doing, because I was trying to enjoy Lord of the Rings the same way I enjoyed Wheel of Time, or The Witcher, which is kind of like reading a bunch of thrillers and then going to Realm of the Elderlings and being like, where's the action and plot twists and like fast plot? It's just like reading Lord of the Rings like that. Lord of the Rings is not as good at that, because it's not as good at being something it isn't trying to be. And it made me realize that Lord of the Rings is not trying to tell a story about how humans tend to act, but how we can act at our best. How people who can be loyal and have courage, resilience, and how those aspects, even in the smallest people, can make such a huge difference, and not how we tend to be. Unlike, say, The Wheel of Time, which I had I binged all 14 Wheel of Time books before reading Lord of the Rings, so I was very much in the Wheel of Time headspace, which is telling a completely different story. Hey, Wheel of Time isn't a Lord of the Rings ripoff, by the way, because it's telling a completely different story. Wheel of Time is how humanity probably would generally, on an individual level, continue to be self-motivated, and how uniting, even in the face of an evil outside force, would be really difficult and complicated. But again, reading Lord of the Rings, I was reading Lord of the Rings and trying to enjoy it in the exact same fashion for the exact same reason, which, as I said, is kind of like reading Realm of the Elderlings and being like, this isn't a good thriller, 2 out of 10. Or Lord of the Rings and saying it isn't a good thriller. And I think both of those types of stories are valuable for their own reason, but I was never gonna enjoy Lord of the Rings that much when I was trying to read it as something it wasn't. And something I do want to mention is that one thing that did contribute to me liking it more the second time, and in fact a major thing, is just that I like the writing style more. If you asked me what type of writing style I preferred at the beginning of 2020, I would have told you I preferred a more straightforward see-through writing style. And now I'm kind of indifferent. I'm still very much like a see-through writing style done well, but I also like, the more Tolkien-esque Hobb, Guy Gavriel Kay, Rockio style of writing. And so as a result, I went from struggling a little bit with the writing style to now thinking Tolkien is one of the best prose writers. And while that definitely played a significant part in my enjoyment of the books, I do think the difference in how I connected to the story, for all the reasons I just mentioned, did likely play a bigger role than me liking the writing style more. So yeah, that is kinda... We're now just going to go into gush mode. That's the part of how I went into reading it differently. I'm probably going to have a bunch of images come up while doing this, the editing me, of, my comments and my thoughts evolving over time. But I'm now going to go through a tale that is as romantic about how human nature can be, a tale where everyone, but also, one thing I do want to mention that's important is it is romantic about how humans can be, but it is set in an extremely dangerous world, full of injustice and evil. And something Rockio pointed out is that everyone in this book spends the entire book expecting to lose. They literally bet it all on a Hail Mary. I should mention, I haven't really spoiled anything up to this point. From this point on, this video is spoilers, but it's Lord of the Rings spoilers. So if you've not read or watched Lord of the Rings, really, if you haven't read it, you should probably click away. And if you haven't done both, whichever one you haven't done, or both, you should go do. You should read it and you should watch it. I generally, if you haven't done either, think you should read the books first, because I always think you should read the books first, but yeah, I'm going to spoil things. And yeah, they literally bet everything on a long shot that would have lost if not for something that, you know, literally no one could have accounted for. No one could have, you know, while planning that out, been like, okay, and then Smeagol is going to try and steal the ring, but then he's going to accidentally destroy it. Like, that would be a ridiculous thing to count on. Anyways, so now, for the somewhat joking way I read it better, is the first time I read it as 3 books in these mass market paperbacks, when obviously it's 1 book, and you need the fancy illustrations. So, once again, same thing as Assassin's Apprentice the first time versus Assassin's Apprentice Illustrated Edition. Maybe the entire premise of this video so far has been bullshit, and the actual reason I enjoyed it more is just the physical edition I read was nicer. Okay, that's unlikely. Anyways, so now we are going to go to kind of, I think, expand upon this. I'm going to go through examples, and this is obviously, it's split to 6 books, and I have a bunch of stuff that I really enjoyed about all 6 of the books. One last thing to mention is, on this read, I did not read this as my primary book. I read 1 chapter a day, and I think this helped to like just read a chapter and then let it marinate. I think almost every chapter in this book stand on its own and is entertaining on its own. Like, I don't think there's a single filler chapter. There are some chapters that, you know, you could make the case could be shorter, but you know what? They're good. Tolkien knows they could be shorter. He just thought it was important. Yeah. Anyways, book 1, which is the first half of Fellowship. The hobbits are just so damn charming. And I think for the first part, like this part in the Shire, A Conspiracy Revealed is my favorite chapter, because the entire time reading it, you think the conspiracy is the conspiracy between Frodo, Gandalf, and Sam. That Frodo is going to take the Ring of Power and is going to try and get it to Rivendell. And so you kind of think, like, it's these people are going to find out about it. Then it turns out the conspiracy is actually between Merry and Pippin, and I think Fatty Bolgar? Maybe? Might have been one other person as well. That, you know, they'd figured out what was going on basically right away, because Sam, as we maybe learn later in these books, this book is not the best at keeping secrets, and that the hobbits have made a conspiracy to help Frodo, and they are going headfirst into danger they barely understand, which is going to come back to an amazing chapter. I think in the section of the Council of Elrond might have been the chapter right after, where Merry and Pippin basically say, no, we're coming too. And Gandalf kind of says, like, if they knew what they were going into, they probably wouldn't go, but they would also feel bad about not going. So, you know what? Maybe we should let them go, and it's great. And that's seen for the first time here. And one thing I kind of lost, which is why I wish there was an alternate reality where, I read Lord of the Rings before watching Lord of the Rings. It's one of the only, fantasy series / books with an adaptation where I watched the film adaptation before reading the books. The other is going to be The Princess Bride, when I read The Princess Bride, because I've seen the movie just a couple times. But the gradual uptick in tension with, like, the Black Riders in the Shire showing up is really good. Tolkien kind of gives you a place that you can identify as a safe place, and instead of waiting for the hobbits to, like, leave safety and then start running into danger, he gives you a place that you can identify as safe and then slowly takes away that feeling of safety. And it's really well done. And one thing I really like about Frodo and Bilbo is just how cheeky they are. Editing Me is going to read 2 passages. Go, Editing Me. "I do not like this news," he said at last. "That Gandalf should be late does not bode well. But it is said, 'Do not meddle in the affairs of wizards, for they are subtle and quick to anger. The choice is yours, to go or wait.' And it is also said," answered Frodo, "Go not to the elves for counsel, for they will say both no and yes." Actually, and Editing Me isn't green. There's obviously the famous one from Bilbo, the "I don't like half of you half as much as I should like, and I like less than half of you half as much as you deserve." But that is not the limit to the cheekiness, and Frodo is pretty cheeky as well, and I'm here for it. Tolkien characters can actually be kind of savage. Like, you got Gandalf insulting Wormtongue later. We need a Tolkien to write like a wit or the fool character. That would be I would be extremely here for that. Maybe that exists in the Silmarillion. I'll find out when I read it. And also, Frodo's I love Frodo's initial reaction when he kind of learns about the whole Ring of Power thing. And it's fear, and that he wants to stay the hell away from this and put it away and not think about it again. Because you know what? Reluctant heroes are a great trope. Fight me. It's way more relatable, and it's usually way more compelling, because I usually find, if you were told all of this and we're just like, oh, let's go, that sounds like an adventure, that character's probably just kind of an idiot. May you live in interesting times is a curse for a reason, and, it's kind of important that Frodo says that he wishes none of this had happened, but, of course, it is not for him to decide. All he can do is choose what to do with the time that is given to him. I think fantasy has a lot of reluctant heroes, and Tolkien deserves some credit for that, because it is a trope I really like and think tends to make a more compelling protagonist than someone who's just like, oh, we're going to war and violence and death. That sounds like a great time. No. And then my favorite chapter in book 1 is Strider, which is where they meet Strider, obviously. And this is another chapter that I really wish I could read, having not watched the movie, because it's not obvious that Strider isn't sketchy. And he realizes very quickly that they haven't gotten the letter from Gandalf, and so he tries to convince them to go with him without being able to name drop himself, and then the letter comes here, and then he does name drop himself, and it's amazing. Editing Me, please read the passage. "You never mentioned Gandalf till this letter came out. You might be a play-acting spy, for all I can see, trying to get us to go with you. You might have done in the real Strider, and took his clothes. What do you have to say to that?" "That you are a stout fellow," answered Strider, "but I'm afraid my only answer to you, Sam Gamgee, is this. If I had killed the real Strider, I could kill you. And I should have killed you already, without so much talk. If I was after the ring, I could have it. Now!" He stood up, and seemed suddenly to grow taller. In his eyes gleamed a light, keen and commanding. Throwing back his cloak, he laid his hand on the hilt of a sword that had hung concealed by his side. They did not dare to move. Sam sat wide-mouthed, staring at him dumbly. "But I am the real Strider, fortunately," he said, looking down at them with his face softened by a sudden smile. "I am Aragorn, son of Arathorn, and if by life or death I can save you, I will." So yeah, that's book 1. It is it's not one of my favorite parts of Lord of the Rings, but it's still pretty damn excellent. It is actually probably my least favorite book, of the 6 in Lord of the Rings, but it's still really good. And next we get to book 2, which would be in the top half for me. Basically, this entire book rules. We start with the Council of Elrond, which has Tolkien plot hole proofing a bunch of stuff. He's like, no, you can't leave the ring with Bombadil. It's a bad idea. We have the bit I talked about where they choose Merry and Pippin to go on the quest. We get introduced to Gimli, who is one of the best characters in this book. He's way cooler than Legolas. I don't even care. Legolas is the worst Fellowship character, and, well, Gimli isn't the best. But Gimli is the best other than the people who are, obvious, like Aragorn, Frodo, Sam, Gandalf. Anyways, And the other chapters I want to talk about quite a bit. Because, Moria is, obviously iconic, the Bridge of Khazad-dûm. One thing that's kind of interesting is that in the books, Gandalf is the one who wants to go to Moria, and it's Aragorn pushing against that, and they try and go up the mountain and are just defeated by nature, which, humanity being defeated by nature. I wonder if that's important. And the Lothlorien chapters are straight up bangers. This is where we learn that Gimli is actually the smoothest man in Middle-earth. Cue editing me. "There is nothing, Lady Galadriel," said Gimli, bowing low and stammering. "Nothing unless it is permitted to ask, nay, to name a single strand of your hair, which surpasses the gold of the earth, as the stars surpass the gems of the mine. I do not ask for such a gift, but you commanded me to name my desire. But tell me, what would you do with such a gift?" "Treasure it, lady," he answered, "in memory of your words to me at our first meeting. And if I ever return to the smithies of my home, it shall be set in imperishable crystal, to be an heirloom of my house and a pledge of goodwill between the mountain and the wood until the end of days." Multiple times, and we get the Mirror of Galadriel, which is my second favorite chapter in Fellowship, probably. Maybe behind Strider, I don't know. It's excellent. Where Galadriel tells Frodo that if he destroys the ring, it's going to, with it, slowly destroy, the wonder of Lothlorien and, the way of life of the elves. But also that he should still do it anyways. So not only are they betting on this long shot Hail Mary, send the Hobbit into the middle of Mordor to throw the ring that only one person, who's Bilbo, has been able to give up willingly, and that was super far away from Mordor. But even if they succeed, it's going to destroy the way of life of what is arguably the most beautiful and wondrous place in Middle-earth. Yeah, kind of a bittersweet story. Not all happiness. It's so good. And I love that Sam makes a song about Gandalf's fireworks, and this is one of the only songs. They cut most of the songs from the movies, but one of the only songs that literally the only songs that they have not just sung in the background, but as the main scene in the movie.
"The finest rockets ever seen. They burst in stars of blue and green, where after thunder, silver showers came falling like a rain of flowers."
Is the song being sung is the song Sam has about Gandalf's fireworks. Good job, Peter Jackson. That was an excellent choice, because if you're going to keep one song, that might just be the way to do it. And one thing I find just incredibly amusing throughout these Lothlorien chapters is elves completely not understanding what the word magic means. Where they're "Here, have these cloaks. They'll blend into whatever you stand next to, and they'll hide you from danger." It's "Oh, the cloak's magic?" And the elves are "Magic? I don't even know what you mean. That's just how they work." Same thing for their boats and for the file and all of that. And then we get to what is actually my favorite chapter in Fellowship of the Ring, which is the breaking of the Fellowship. We have Frodo remaining cheeky, where Boromir tries to convince him that he should bring the ring to Minas Tirith. And he's "Wow, you've really made my decision easy." Boromir's "So you'll come?" And he's "No." And Frodo's then kind of has the introspective bit where he puts on the ring and sees all around Mount Doom and gets some internal conflict, and it's wonderful. And he decides, all right, I have to go alone, which is also sparked from what he saw in the Mirror of Galadriel. And then when everyone is running to find him, and Sam knows him better than anyone else and goes back to the boats. Sam is amazing. This is really where Sam starts to become ultra amazing, and book 4 is going to contain more of Sam's amazingness, and then book 6 is going to be all right. Next, book 3. What do I like about book 3? Basically all of it. Book 3 is my second favorite book in Lord of the Rings. I think book 2 would be third, probably. Gimli's so fantastic in this book. I don't even care. He's one of my favorite Lord of the Rings characters. on one page, when they're surrounded by the Riders of Rohan, which is legitimately one of my favorite chapters in this book, and Eomer is like, oh, you came from Lothlorien, that's pretty sketchy. And while surrounded with spears, Gimli and Aragorn are both just like, hell no. Editing me is going to, again, cue in those quotes. Let Gimli the dwarf, the Loin's son, warn you against foolish words. You speak evil of that which is fair beyond the reach of your thought, and only little wit can excuse you. I serve no man, said Aragorn, but the servants of Sauron I pursue into whatever land they may go. There are few among mortal men who know more of orcs, and I do not hunt them in this fashion out of choice. The orcs whom we pursued took captive 2 of my friends. In such a need, a man that has no horse will go on foot, and he will not ask for leave to follow the trail, nor will he count the heads of the enemy, save with a sword. I am not weaponless. Aragorn threw back his cloak. The elven sheath glittered as he grasped it, and the bright blade of Anduril shone like a sudden flame as he swept it out. Elendil, he cried, I am Aragorn, son of Arathorn, and I am called Elisar, the Elfstone, Dunedain, and the heir to Isildur, Elendil's son of Gondor. Here is the sword that was broken, and it is forged again. Will you aid me or thwart me? Choose swiftly. One of the most random details in this book that I found hilarious is that Sauron steals horses from Rohan, but he only steals black horses. He could steal more horses, but he had to choose between maintaining his image and having all color-coordinated horses, so all black. And the other option is have more horses, maybe have a stronger cavalry force, but have some brown horses, some gray horses, and even some white horses, which just... it just doesn't fit with his image. And you know what? The man's got an image to maintain, and I can respect that. And finally, that once again, in the books, Gimli's cooler than Legolas, and it isn't even close, which is one of the reasons why he wins the competition at Helm's Deep. And this isn't the movies where he says 40, where Legolas is like 42, and then Gimli's like 43. No, Legolas gets 41, and Gimli wins legitimately because he's really good with that axe, and he ended up in the caverns, which he's going to talk about later, to Legolas, and he saved all the people hiding there, and won legitimately with 42. And also something I wanted to note for Book 3 is I was reading Kingdoms of Death while going through Book 3, and the chapter where Gandalf comes back was a nice bit of hope and optimism at the turn of the tide, and I needed that. Yes. So Book 4, and this is the book really of Frodo and Sam's relationship. Sam makes a lot of mistakes in this book, and yet all of his mistakes end up being endearing. He goes to climb down the cliff first, and Frodo's like, no, I'll go down first. He doesn't tie Gollum tight enough with the magic rope because he doesn't want to hurt him. He makes some rabbit stew that leads to them being found by Faramir's men. He gives away that they have the ring. But you know what? Somehow he makes mistakes, and it makes him more endearing. And Sam's internal monologue is very self-deprecating and very enjoyable, and I love it, and it's great. One thing I also want to mention is there's something that I find is a really annoying trope, and it is something that may have slightly come from Lord of the Rings, but it doesn't do the annoying trope in Lord of the Rings. And this annoying trope is when you have a fantasy character in a book. I'm looking at you, Koth. I see you. And they talk about... a lot of series do this. Wheel of Time does it. A lot of series do. They talk about how in the stories that they read, everything is always so simple, and everything goes well. There's never any problems. Everything just works out fantastically. And every time I'm like, do the people in this world only have terrible authors who can't tell interesting stories? Meanwhile, you got Samwise, who does, I think, spoil the Silmarillion a little bit, but the in-world Lord of the Rings stories sound awesome. They sound fantastic. And, like, come on, there's two things. Fantasy in general obviously took a lot from Tolkien. And there's two things they didn't, for the most part. And they really should have. And one is the in-world stories actually sounding good and being motivational to the heroes. And in not just being like, well, unlike in the stories where everything goes well, in my story, there's complications. Well, in Lord of the Rings, there's complications in the actual story and in the in-world story. People should have copied that. And the other is that chainmail is actually effective armor in Lord of the Rings, the book. And the authors after that apparently couldn't figure that out. Come on, fantasy authors. Chainmail is useful. Yeah. And obviously the end of book 4 is amazing, like the entire climb up. And then the confrontation with Shelob. You got Sam taking the ring. And next we get to part 5, which is the hype part. It's got Pelennor Fields. It's got Pelennor Fields. It's got Pelennor Fields, but I'm saying it again. And it's got the actual best part, which is when the party decides to march on the Black Gate, which is a complete fool's hope. It is like, hey, you know that hobbit who's never been outside the Shire, who we sent into the realm of darkness to destroy the ring in the middle of that realm in a giant volcano, and this is the ring that no one has ever given up willingly except for Bilbo, who was in the Shire and super far from it. Yeah, not only are we resting on that hope, we are now going to march on Mount Doom, where we're probably all going to die, to try and give this Fool's Hope chance a slightly better chance. Everyone expects to lose. This is like a long shot Hail Mary. But it's the only chance they have. And so Gandalf recommends they do it. I gotta say, Gandalf, his advice looks really good. If things went wrong, like, it was still good advice, because even if they didn't follow his advice, it would have given them, like, no chance at winning, and his advice gave them a small chance at winning. But he looks really good, partially just because things go their way. He would have looked kind of dumb in hindsight if Frodo and Sam had just been killed, like, a book and a half ago, and they marched on the Black Gate and just all died. But it still would have been the right thing to do, but it just would have not looked like the right thing to do to those around him. And now we get to book 6. And book 6 is easily my favorite. I think book 6 is my favorite, and then book 3, and then book 2, and then book 5, and then book 4, and then book 1. But book 6 is, like, by far. The other 5 are really close together, but this one, not even close. And this is both, it starts with, there's like the climax of the book, and then there's a really long falling action, and they're both completely brilliant. And the climax of the book has Mount Doom, which is my favorite chapter in this book. It is Frodo and Sam, like, dragging themselves through this absolutely horrid land. They're lacking water. They're lacking food. Frodo's falling into the ground. Frodo's, like, hallucinating a wheel of fire that he sees with his unwakened, like, even when he's not asleep. Like, this is, like, the most desperate last chance. And it is peak danger. It is somehow, even though they are the closest they have been to Mount Doom and victory, it feels like they are with no orcs in their way, it feels like they're the farthest away they've been from victory. And this chapter also contains my single favorite moment in the book, which is Sam sparing Smeagol in this chapter. He has Sting. He is Smeagol. He could have stabbed Smeagol. And you have a Sam who has gained understanding. He has been a ring bearer now, and he understands what that means. And he gains pity. He has gained, again, like Frodo has throughout the entire thing, like book 4, for the same reason Frodo has been sparing Smeagol. He gains the wisdom to be merciful, to not deal out death and judgment. And they would have lost if he hadn't done this. If he had done the more practical thing to do at the time. If, people often, to my annoyance, complain when characters do not do the logical thing. And I like to point out that Logic Bot, who always makes sensible, logical decisions given all the information they have, well, if Logic Bot replaced Samwise the Brave, then Sauron would have won, and everything would have been terrible. And Aragorn would have died, and Frodo would have died, and Sam would have died, and they all would have died or been enslaved by Sauron, and the Shire would have been destroyed. So take that, Logic Bot. So we have confirmation that Samwise the Brave is better than Logic Bot. Not just as a character, but also when it comes to defeating Sauron. Because, like Frodo even says it, it's basically how this chapter ends. They would have lost at the very bitter end after all this strife. If Sam didn't spare Smeagol, because Frodo would have just taken the ring, and then Asgol would have showed up and been like, yoink. And Sauron would have been like, oh, this is shiny, and then everyone would have lost. And now we have the falling action. This Mount Doom-ish might have even been like Book 5 was where I was when I made my fantasy character tier list. So Frodo was actually too low. Frodo should have been higher. So if you go back to the first one I did, Sam should be way higher, because that was well before I did my reread. And Frodo was before this part. And the falling action, I think, is the best part of Frodo's character, and it's why the Scouring of the Shire is in fact my second favorite chapter in this book. And I think the first time I read the Scouring of the Shire, I was like, this is fun, watching like Merry and Pippin like retake the Shire really easily. The part where the guy there, who's really full of himself, is like, the king, well, when a messenger comes from the king, then maybe I'll act on that. And Pippin is just like, you activated my trap card. I am a messenger from the king, so get wrecked. And this time, my favorite part of this chapter was Frodo trying to get everyone to show mercy. The entire chapter, because Frodo doesn't become famous among the hobbits. He doesn't really do anything in this chapter, if I'm being completely honest. Like, he doesn't... If he wasn't there, they would have retaken the Shire, like, just as easily. On the other hand, if Merry and Pippin weren't there, they probably wouldn't have taken it at all. Like, Merry and Pippin practically have gained more knowledge in terms of, like, here's a challenge, we have to overcome that challenge. They've learned more about warfare. And I'm just repeating a comment I posted in like, Daniel's Discord. But Frodo, you feel, has gained the greater wisdom, the higher wisdom. He has gained the wisdom of mercy. He has had a burden that no one else, except for really Sam, can even begin to understand. Not even Merry and Pippin, who the other hobbits don't even know that he did anything. And they don't even know that, like, you know, without Frodo, Sauron would have won. Granted, without Sam, Sauron would have won. And there's a case to be made without Merry or Pippin, Sauron would have won. But without Frodo, the most Sauron would have won. Because he doesn't really do anything. He just tries to tell everyone to, like, spare people. Like, even Saruman and Wormtongue. And they spare some people, but also, like, you can see they fail at times. They deal out death, and you can see it breaks Frodo's heart, because he's just so done with death and warfare. He has learned the wisdom of mercy, that mercy is usually the right option, and that compassion is more important than at times than, like, achieving victory through the easiest means. So, Steven Erikson moment, basically. And it's just, it's so heartbreaking watching him try and, like, resolve this conflict through peaceful means, and watch people not listen to him. And then you get to Greyhaven, which is another just incredible chapter. It's the final chapter. It's the end of this book, where it says, I will not say do not weep, for not all tears are an evil, which is good, because these pages were a little bit blurry. We have a passage about Frodo, and one thing that, there's a quote from the chapter before Scouring. Though I may come to the Shire, it will not seem the same, for I shall not be the same. I am wounded with knife, sting, and tooth, and a long burden. Where shall I find rest? And this continues in Greyhaven with one of my favorite quotes, which editing me is going to read now. But said Sam, and tears started in his eyes. "I thought you were going to enjoy the Shire too. For years and years, after all you have done." "So I thought too, once. But I have been too deeply hurt, Sam. I tried to save the Shire, and it has been saved, but not for me. It must often be so, Sam. When things are in danger, someone has to give them up, lose them, so that others may keep them. But you are also my heir. All that I had, and might have, I leave to you. And also you have Rose, and Eleanor, and Frodo lad will come, and Rosie lass, and Mary, and Goldilocks, and Pippin, and perhaps more that I cannot see. Your hands and your wits will be needed everywhere. You will be the mayor, of course, as long as you want to be, and the most famous gardener in history, and you will read things out of the Red Book, and keep alive the memory of the age that is gone, so that people will remember the great danger, and so love their beloved land all the more, and that will keep you as busy and as happy as anyone can be, as long as your part of the story goes on." Because, even though he saved the Shire, he could not save it for himself, because he could not save it without destroying the part of him that could live happily in the Shire. And man, this ending hits hard. First time it didn't hit hard at all. I was just like, that was a good ending. This time though, man, I was so much more invested in Frodo as a character, and that just hurt. I think it's pretty fair to say that this part of the story and this aspect of the story is something that Tolkien took from his, got from his time in World War I. Not saying it's allegory, but obviously when you're writing something and you've experienced being, at the Battle of the Somme, that that influences you as a person. And gives you a level of appreciation for those who, leave society and go through some really horrific things and then come back. Because, like it is for Frodo, even if the Shire or where you come back to or home is the same, Frodo is not the same. Just like many people are not the same. And it's just... man, the falling action in this book is actually so good. Same thing for the movies. All the endings should be there. They're all necessary. Yeah. And I totally disagree with the Return of the King complaints that there's too many endings. There should be more endings. No, I don't know if they could have done the Scouring of the Shire justice, but there could have been more endings. Also, I love how Gandalf is just like, I did my job. You guys can retake the Shire. I'm gonna go chat with Tom Bombadil now. He seems like a cool dude, and I don't have to worry about this. So yeah, that is my spoilery gush fest for The Lord of the Rings. Probably the most influential book of the 20th century. Definitely the most influential for fantasy. It is an influence that even the authors who are not directly inspired by it, who write fantasy, are inspired by it in some way. Because even if you write a fantasy book and you've never read Lord of the Rings, you've read a book from an author who's read Lord of the Rings and was in some way inspired by it. And you've done that a lot, unless you just don't read fantasy. And frankly, there's probably quite a few books that aren't fantasy that were inspired in a lot of ways by Lord of the Rings. So, fantasy has obviously come a long way. It is, the people who think fantasy is just full of Tolkien ripoffs, don't read fantasy, and they're really annoying. But, this is a book which has an incalculable influence, and it really deserves it. I have a top book list at the end of the year, and I am going to be going on a technicality and saying that the first time I read The Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, and Return of the King, that's 3 books, didn't have Lord of the Rings anywhere on my read list, so this will be viable for top book list at the end of the year, and I can almost guarantee it's going to be on it. Is this literally my favorite book of all time now? No, it's not quite that high up there. I did give it 5 stars on Goodreads. If you want to know the rating, I'd give it a 9.3 out of 10. I obviously think it's completely excellent. There are, some parts of it that I didn't find to be the most compelling ever. But it's really excellent, and I really did love it. I'm sure in some point in the distant future, I'll probably reread it again. Probably won't be for like a decade. And you know what? I'll probably like it even more. So that is the story of how I reread The Lord of the Rings and why I enjoyed it so much more and the frame of mind I was in to read it wrong the first time. If you are, like me, a primarily modern fantasy reader and think, hey, maybe I read Lord of the Rings in a similar mindset, I highly encourage you to give it another shot. If you think, if you're at this point in the video, you probably are someone who already loves Lord of the Rings, and I'm preaching to the choir here. Obviously, hi Bengus, if you're still watching this, if you think you'll still hate Lord of the Rings, or just don't want to reread a 450,000 page book, then don't. Don't let me tell you what to do, because I'm not telling you what to do, but even if I was, don't let me tell you. But that is all I got. I hope you enjoyed me talking about Lord of the Rings. Obviously, I don't make a huge amount of content about Lord of the Rings, because as a lot of people who make booktube videos say, feel like if something has been said about Lord of the Rings, it's been said before, because the book came out in 1955 and has just been read and talked about a couple times. But I do think that I want to make this video because I think it can show how expectations going into a book can affect how much you enjoy it, which is one reason why I do make reviews, and I make spoiler-free reviews. So if you've wondered why, for the most part, I don't make spoiler reviews, it's because I think one of the beneficial parts of reviews is that people can watch it before they read a book and not only have an idea of how much they will like it, but have the right set of expectations, which can actually lead to them enjoying it more. So that is all I got. Bye, everyone.